And welcome to Wellness Wednesdays, Digestive Health Edition. Hey there, everybody who's watching live, and then also the recording. Let me know in the notes what it is about this conversation that really resonates with you, what you're taking away, what your thoughts are as you hear. Tonight, I am going to try to do this topic of leaky gut or intestinal permeability just a little bit of justice. I was looking at some of my notes and thinking, what did I get myself into committing to this, right? But try to give you some takeaways, some basic ideas to work with, so that, you have some ideas. So let me pull up some notes here for you so you have that. So what's the deal with leaky gut? You may have heard this term all over the place on Dr. Google. If you've been in the integrative nutrition space, if you've been doing some reading about gastrointestinal health, digestive health, all the things that can impact it, you've probably seen this term pop up a time or two. So we are going to dive into what's true, what's actually scientifically backed, and what to do about it, why it even matters. All right, so let's start with Google, shall we? Because this is where you get your information, right, these days. So what does Google say? Is it giving us what we really need? So a quick Google search of leaky gut yields some of the following signs and symptoms of this condition of leaky gut: digestive issues, seasonal allergies or asthma, PMS or PCOS, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, lupus, psoriasis, celiac disease, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, depression, anxiety, ADD, ADHD, acne, rosacea, eczema, candida overgrowth, food intolerances, food allergies, inflammatory bowel disease, fatigue, moodiness, irritability, sleeplessness, autism, and more. So if you're thinking, I think this might be a little bit too simplistic to be true, that something that sounds like science fiction could be causing all of these things, I think it's time to really take a look at what are some of the mechanisms that could be at play here. So our goal is to set the record straight. Let's start with a definition and understanding of what a healthy intestinal barrier is, because if the gut is leaky, it's not together like it should be, right? So in our guts, really, really simple anatomy, we have epithelial cells that line our intestinal wall. We have behind that, we have basically some different tissues. And then in front of that, kind of in between our epithelial cells and our stomach, our intestine where food goes through, there's a mucin layer there that is a kind of a protective layer in our GI tract. And so basically, leaky gut is thought to occur when things are getting through the mucin layer and past the epithelial cells into those next layers. So ideally what we want to be happening is we want those epithelial cells to have little gates that are called tight junctions, that's the scientific term, between them, so that they're able to, the gaps in between the cells are able to selectively open. Ideally, of course, we want nutrients to be able to move through. We want fluid to be able to move through, but we don't want things to go through like pathogens, like undigested food, like food proteins, right? All different kind of toxins and contaminants that we might be eating. We want those to just come into our intestine and then leave, right? Not be coming into our bloodstream. So in order to allow only the right things in, the intestine's regulation system really needs these tight junction proteins in between the cells to be working really well, to know what to do, to let only the right things in, to be nice and strong and intelligent, right? In some ways, so they can sense what's okay and what's not. So what goes wrong now that we have a sense of what should be happening? We should have the epithelial cells nice and tight, tight junction proteins, and then the mucin layer. Well, what can happen is that for a number of reasons, some of which we'll go into, the junction between the epithelial cells, the intestinal cells, can start to weaken. So the tight junction proteins are not really doing their job. And that can allow bacteria, pathogens, proteins to move into mucosal tissue where they should not be. When they do move into mucosal tissue, we have some different sensors within our intestinal wall that are sensing out pathogens and start to send out an alert that, all right, there's invaders here, there's pathogens, they shouldn't be here, which starts to breed a bit of an inflammatory response, which would be a good thing if that inflammatory response could really clear the pathogens. But if they're constantly coming in past the epithelial cells where they shouldn't be, that response can become chronic. And you can imagine that over time, what the research is saying is that if you have that chronic inflammatory response, that in and of itself can cause some damage to the mucosal tissue, even some scarring. From that, you have more inflammation. So it ends up being this vicious cycle where things are coming in, mucosal tissue is being irritated, and digestive health really suffers. We feel it, day-to-day symptoms. The GI tract also does host our innate immune response, right? We have this built-in immune system right there in our guts. It's basically the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, right, is the name of it. And so when the immune system in our gut is overreactive because these things are coming in that shouldn't be, that's where you start to get in some cases, pretty serious immune dysregulation, where because so much of that immune system is housed there, our whole body's immune system is, it can affect the immune system overall. And so that's where there really does seem to be a link it makes sense. There's a mechanism there. It's being documented as an association between intestinal permeability or a gut barrier wall that's not functional and some of these autoimmune or more inflammatory disorders, including inflammatory bowel disease, for example, where there really is some mucosal damage. So let's talk a little bit more about how the health of our intestine impacts our whole bodies. In truth, the health of the barrier that's there in our GI tract does help to determine our level of tolerance to what our body senses as kind of these antigens or pathogens. In other words, because our immune system is really tied in to our gastrointestinal health, when these tight junctions are letting in too many things that don't belong, it actually, not only causes dysregulation, but also changes the way that our immune system even responds to different foods. So it starts to say, when you eat something, instead of, oh yeah, this is safe, instead it says, okay, the last time I saw this protein from this food, it was in my mucosal tissue where it shouldn't have been, and I had this adverse immune response to it. So all of a sudden, it's like the body's signals start to get mixed, where it recognizes these previously safe foods as dangerous or pathogenic. And that is in part where some of the what seem to be out of control food sensitivities and potentially even allergies might come from this link in part. And so when you think about, some of the autoimmune diseases that have risen in prevalence right along with allergies and skin conditions and some other things that are being linked, we're thinking about multiple sclerosis. We're thinking about Crohn's disease, systemic lupus, primary biliary cirrhosis, autoimmune thyroiditis, right, where the thyroid is developing its own autoimmune disease. And really interestingly, there's even some correlations between intestinal permeability, dysregulated immune system function, and celiac disease, which is really, really incredible thinking about wow, how there's really no treatment for that, right? Other than avoiding the thing the body's reacting to, just gluten itself. So I hope that's making sense so far, and just giving you a sense of what really is happening, what should be happening, and what can go wrong. So let's talk about just a few things. Again, there are many, right? Many factors, but 3 things that can promote intestinal permeability or make it more likely to occur. So factor 1, I'm sorry to those of you who might be sipping a margarita right now, but too much alcohol. Too much alcohol. If you've ever known someone who really loves, right, really loves to just like sit down with the 6-pack on the daily, often those people are struggling with gastritis, kind of this non-specific inflammation. It really can be damaging to the tissue, but it also does tend to lead to weaker tight junction proteins. So individuals who drink a lot of alcohol tend to have a higher rate of this intestinal permeability happening. Factor number 2, there's a lot we could say about this, but it's really not having enough of these microbiota accessible carbohydrates, which are basically just the complex fibrous compounds that our gut bacteria want to be eating. You know, that's their fuel source. When I was talking about that mucin layer that was over the epithelial cells, that is kind of in some ways, a first line of defense, right? That mucin layer is made up in large part of bacteria. And here's the thing, when we don't have enough fuel for the other bacteria that are in our gut, believe it or not, those bacteria in our gut need to eat. And so they start to degrade the mucin layer, eat or wear down the mucin layer. And so what could have been otherwise a very healthy, thick, protective kind of mucus coating, so that, you know, things weren't as likely to get through, over time ends up becoming thinner and less protective because we haven't given our microbiome, the good bacteria in our guts, enough fuel. And so some of the foods that often come to mind, thinking about microbiota accessible carbohydrates, would be things like bananas that are a little bit unripe, legumes, jicama, Jerusalem artichoke, oats, right? There's quite a long list of them. A good resource for this, you know, where you can just learn a whole lot more about this topic, is The Good Gut by the Sonnenbergs, who are out of Stanford. But the idea really here is that, man, we often really have to get our plant food intake up big time because we are just not getting in enough fiber overall, and especially not these microbiota accessible carbohydrates that act as fuel. So go get yourself some oatmeal, folks, while you're watching this. And then, yeah, so factor number 3 is gut dysbiosis. Okay, it doesn't sound so good. It's not so good. So basically what this dysbiosis is not enough good bacteria, too many bad bacteria, or a very low diversity of bacteria. Again, it's going to happen for many reasons, but some of them would be that A, we're not producing enough short chain fatty acids, which are a fuel source. B, antibiotics, certain medication uses. Yeah, there's a whole list of medications, but often it really is diet related. So there's a little bit of evidence that it could be related to potentially some of the more processed foods because of the type of carbohydrates that are in there, and maybe even certain emulsifiers like gums, etc., in our food supply that could be contributing in some way. A lot of our gut microbiota mix is really set up in childhood. So things like whether you were breastfed or not, the type of delivery that you had, medication use early on can really shape your microbiome and kind of set you up for success or not so much later on. For most of us, some of the best things we can do is just make sure that, okay, we're getting rid of any bad guys if needed, right? There's, you know, just thinking through yeah, there's different food-based interventions and then sometimes supplement interventions. Making sure we're supporting the growth of the good guys. So plenty of fiber, microbiota accessible carbohydrates. And then also sometimes actually supplementing with or eating the good probiotics. So fermented foods, right? So kimchi, sauerkraut, all that good stuff that can help to replenish our supply of the good guys. The reason this is so important when you think about intestinal permeability is that if you only have a lot of bad bacteria that are overrepresented, if your colonies of good bacteria are really weak, basically what happens is they end up sending out signaling molecules, these not so good guys, which can over time weaken some of those tight junctions. And so yeah, it can be hard to measure, obviously, but just kind of knowing what intestinal permeability is linked with can sometimes give you a clue that paying more attention to the link can make sense if you can put some things in place. Okay, so let's talk about some good news. Let's talk about some things you could do to potentially improve or strengthen your intestinal barrier function. So strategy number 1, zinc carnosine. Love me some zinc. There have been a number of trials done on zinc carnosine that show improvements in tight junction proteins and the actual permeability between the cell walls. In brief, zinc depletion, and zinc is just a mineral, does lead to intestinal permeability. Zinc deficiency does. And zinc is something that we can get through our diets, of course. It's hard to get in an all plant-based diet, actually very, very difficult. But if you're eating animal proteins, especially red meat, you typically will get quite a bit. But if your gut is not in good shape, what can happen is you can lose zinc. And so instead of absorbing all of it, some of it just kind of passes through unabsorbed because you just don't have the proper structure in place. And sometimes that can be, just an absorption issue, right, overall. So sometimes supplementing with zinc carnosine for like 6 to 8 weeks can be helpful. It can give you guys some ideas for specific products or interventions if that would be helpful. But butyrate is just complementary. So it's a short chain fatty acid that helps to basically nourish the microbiome and nourish some of the tissues that are there in our intestinal tract. So yes, okay. And then L-glutamine. So if you have done any reading about leaky gut, you've seen this one, I'm sure. Glutamine is the primary preferred fuel source for our enterocytes. It's considered to be an essential amino acid. Conditionally essential amino acid, meaning that we technically should make it and should be fine. But under periods of prolonged stress, sometimes we just don't have enough. So in certain cases, it's essential, hence conditionally essential. See that? So basically because glutamine is a fuel source for these intestinal cells, if the intestinal wall does not have their primary preferred fuel source, it can contribute to some of that leakiness, and then also just to poor health of the cells overall. So interestingly enough, there's been a number of studies about L-glutamine. One had 12 patients enrolled, and they all had diarrhea predominant irritable bowel syndrome, which is, basically what you have when they can't figure out what you have, right? So just a lot of like gas and bloating and ickiness and diarrhea in this case. And glutamine supplementation was shown to increase expression of claudin-1, which is one of those proteins that's there, and helped with diarrhea, helped with IBS. So that's awesome. Little symptom reduction there. And then strategy number 3 is to just bring the microbiome back into balance. So I wanted to focus on 2 specific strains here. One is Lactobacillus rhamnosus, R0011. This number is really important because it's the strain It's the strain of the probiotic or bacteria. And you do not know what you're getting unless you see this strain. This is essential. And then L. helveticus R00. So these are two to just kind of hold on to and maybe look for. So yeah, the relevance here is that basically, so I'll tell you a little bit more about this study, that I have some notes about. So the study was titled "The Role of Luminal Factors in the Recovery of Gastric Function and Behavioral Changes After Chronic H. pylori Infection." So for those of you who don't know, H. pylori is an infection that often causes ulcers. It really does wear down your intestinal wall. And so what this one study was looking at with these two strains of bacteria specifically is they were looking to see, okay, so how does supplementing with these two probiotic strains impact or help the body recover from the damage that H. pylori has done? And so it was an animal study, but they were given the probiotics for 2 weeks after they had this chronic H. pylori infection eradicated or taken care of. The infection had caused increased intestinal permeability and also decreased CD3 cell counts, which is an indication of weakened immune system function. And so sure enough, these two probiotics helped to reverse the intestinal permeability, and also they measured this, increased the CD3 cell count. So overall, just supported immune cell function, which is fabulous. And again, it makes sense because a lot of that immune system is in your gut, right? So yes, so in summary, this was a lot to try to cover in a Facebook Live. But the idea is that although Dr. Google does exaggerate a lot and about leaky gut and many other things, there truly is a scientifically documented link between intestinal permeability, poor health of the gastrointestinal function, and these more autoimmune, chronic inflammatory type conditions, simply because when things are going where they don't belong and the immune system gets upregulated because of it, the body's in emergency mode. And so damage can be done. But the good news is that by using many of the tools we have available to us in integrative and functional nutrition and medicine, that you can not only improve a lot of your symptoms, but also can truly support the health of your gastrointestinal tract over the long term. So thank you so much to those of you who have listened and are listening to the recording. I will see you next Wednesday. So have a wonderful evening and stay warm. Bye-bye.